The click of heels against marble preceded them, a sound too confident, too deliberate, cutting through the morning silence like a sharpened blade. Then came his voice, low and unhurried in the hallway, carrying that familiar grounding resonance that used to make Savannah feel safe. Now it just made her skin crawl. She kept her eyes locked on the screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard with a rigid, practiced grace. Her spine was a straight line of pure tension, a posture she'd spent 2 years and 3 months perfecting until it felt less like a choice and more like a suit of armor. "Don't look up." She looked up. Dominic Hayes moved through the glass doors of Hayes & Co. at exactly 8:47 a.m. with a woman anchored to his arm and an expression so vacant it was haunting. The woman was a study in effortless wealth. Blonde, slim, draped in a silk shift dress that likely cost more than Savannah's monthly rent. Her hand rested in the crook of his elbow with a practiced ease, her thumb grazing the expensive wool of his suit jacket, as if she'd owned that space for a lifetime. She leaned in, whispering something against his ear that dissolved into a soft, melodic laugh. Dominic didn't mirror the smile, but he didn't pull away either. He remained a pillar of cold indifference, allowing the intimacy without acknowledging it. Savannah's fingers froze. Only 14 hours ago she had been pinned against the cold mahogany of Conference Room B. She could still feel the phantom ghost of his hand cradling her jaw, the rough calluses of his palm contrasting with the predatory heat of his mouth. For a few frantic minutes, he had kissed her like a man starving, his breath hitching, unsteady and broken against her lips. When they finally pulled apart, he had kept his eyes closed for one extra heartbeat, a flicker of vulnerability that Savannah had mistaken for a beginning. She had stood there in the dark, her pulse hammering against her ribs, thinking with a reckless, terrifying certainty, "This changes everything." "Good morning, Ms. Reed." The voice was directly in front of her now, stripping away the memory like a cold cloth. She met his gaze. His eyes were green and entirely unreadable, the exact same shade of emerald ice she had greeted every morning for the last 2 years. There wasn't a flicker of recognition, not a single shadow of the previous night's fire lingering in the depths of his pupils. "Good morning, Mr. Hayes." Her voice was a marvel of professional stability. She could feel the frantic thud of her heart against her sternum, but her vocal cords remained as cold and disciplined as his. The woman on his arm turned, offering a smile so polished it felt synthetic. "I don't think we've met. I'm Vanessa." Savannah tracked the movement, the manicured hand, the subtle glint of a diamond bracelet, the way Vanessa leaned into Dominic's side with the casual gravity of a moon orbiting its planet. "Savannah Reed, Mr. Hayes' executive assistant." "Oh, wonderful." Vanessa's smile remained perfectly fixed. "I've heard so much about the office." Dominic offered nothing to the conversation. His gaze had already drifted past them both, fixed intently on his office door as if the woman on his arm and the one behind the desk were merely obstacles in his path. "Hold my 9 o'clock for 10 minutes, he clipped, his tone dismissing her before he even finished the sentence. He walked away, Vanessa trailing in his wake, their footsteps falling into a rhythmic, synchronized tap against the stone. The heavy glass door swung shut behind them with a pressurized hiss that seemed to suck the remaining oxygen out of the room. Savannah turned back to her screen. The cursor blinked at her, steady, patient, a rhythmic pulse of white light that felt like a mockery of her own hesitation. The pain didn't arrive as a scream or a frantic burst of tears. It was quieter than that, a sharp, surgical ache that settled directly behind her ribs, cold and precise. She had no right to be surprised. He was Dominic Hayes. He didn't navigate through feelings, he navigated through maneuvers. Somewhere between the grueling late nights and the shared silences in the hallways, she had allowed herself to forget that to a man like him, intimacy was just another variable to be managed. She didn't finish the letter until 11:14 p.m. that night. She sat at her kitchen table, the air in the apartment smelling faintly of the tea that had long since gone cold in her mug. She read the text once, her eyes scanning the sterile, professional font. She didn't change a single word. Her movements were slow, almost mechanical, as she folded the paper with sharp, aggressive creases. She set it beside her bag for the morning, a white flag disguised as a departure. He read the document without a flicker of expression, his features settling into that familiar, impenetrable mask. Savannah had watched Dominic Hayes dismantle quarterly reports, sign termination notices, and gut hostile acquisition proposals with that exact same look, jaw set like granite, eyes tracking the lines with a clinical, predatory focus that gave nothing away. It was the very trait that made him formidable in a boardroom, and the one that, against every grain of her logic, had made her fall for the ghost of the man beneath the suit. She stood in front of his expansive desk, her pulse a frantic, rhythmic drumming against her ribs that she was certain he could hear in the oppressive silence of the office. He looked up, the movement slow and deliberate. 2 weeks. Yes. Is there a reason? He began, his voice dropping an octave, catching on a jagged edge of something he refused to name, that you aren't willing to state in writing? There are 40 of them, Dominic, and they all started in conference room B. Personal reasons, Mr. Hayes, she replied. The lie tasted like copper in her mouth, sharp and metallic. He held the letter between 2 fingers, hovering over the desk as if debating whether to shred it or throw it back at her. Finally, he set it down. The soft thud of the paper against the polished wood sounded like a gavel bringing a trial to a close. Fine. 2 weeks. That was it. The door was closed. The ensuing 14 days stretched out with a suffocating texture, thick, heavy, and gray, like trying to run through waist-deep water that was slowly hardening into concrete. Savannah moved through the office like a specter of her former self. She trained her replacement with a hollowed-out patience, organizing files and archiving emails while her mind obsessively looped the memory of his hands on her skin. She left meticulous margin notes on the systems only she understood, her handwriting neat and disciplined even as her fingers trembled against the pen. Dominic was a masterpiece of professional calibration. He offered good mornings and thank yous with a sterile precision that made Savannah feel as though she were hallucinating the heat of his mouth against hers. But the cracks were there, hidden in the periphery. She caught the way his gaze would snag on her empty chair when he thought she was occupied. A fleeting look of genuine disorientation. There was that fraction of a second, a jagged pause, before he uttered her name. Then there was the Tuesday afternoon when a text from Maya actually made her laugh, a genuine sound that broke through the office gloom. She looked up to find Dominic framed in his office doorway, his mask slipping to reveal a raw, aching hunger that didn't belong on the face of a CEO. He tore his eyes away instantly. The silence that followed was deafening. Vanessa appeared twice that week, a vision of curated perfection. On Thursday, she bypassed the desk entirely, entering his office without a knock. The sound of her practiced melodic laughter filtered through the glass, bright and artificial, like a bell being struck in an empty room. Friday, the final day, arrived with a cold, biting clarity. Savannah reached the office before the sun, clearing her workspace with a surgical efficiency. She tucked away the photo of her mother, the spare cardigan that still smelled faintly of the office espresso machine, and the small, stubborn succulent she'd bought 18 months ago to keep the sterile air from choking her. By 5:30, the floor was a graveyard of empty desks. She shouldered her bag, cradled the small plant against her chest, and walked toward the elevators. She didn't look toward his door. She couldn't afford to lose her nerve when the finish line was 5 feet away. The elevator chimes echoed through the lobby. The doors slid open. She stepped inside, the cool air of the car feeling like the first breath of freedom. Savannah. The voice came from directly behind her, closer than she'd prepared for. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Dominic stood there, stripped of his armor. His suit jacket was gone, his sleeves were shoved up to his forearms, and his face held an expression of panicked, unfinished business. A look of a man watching his last lifeline fray. The elevator doors began to groan shut, narrowing the world down to the sliver of space between them. She didn't reach for the sensor. She let the steel plates meet. Monday arrived with its usual, indifferent mechanical precision. A gray, relentless tide of obligations that didn't care who had been broken over the weekend. Dominic stepped into the office at 7:55 a.m. The air was already thick with the scent of fresh, roasted coffee, a smell that usually signaled the start of his focus. His new assistant, Claire, was already stationed at the outer desk. She was efficient, her greeting crisp and perfectly timed. She confirmed his 8:30, offered him water, and handled the phones with a practiced ease. He gave a short nod of acknowledgement and retreated into his office. He sat, the leather of his chair creaking under his weight, and flipped open his laptop. The blue light of the inbox reflected in his eyes, but his mind was elsewhere, snagged on the silence filtering in from the hallway. He looked up. Through the glass partition, the outer desk sat in the harsh morning light. It was sterile. Claire had already reclaimed the space, shifting the monitor and rearranging the stationery into a sensible, logical order. The small, stubborn green of the succulent was gone, replaced by a void that made the marble desktop look cavernous. The stack of color-coded folders, the ones Savannah had maintained with a system so intricate it had once forced a rare, genuine smile from him, had been dismantled. The ghost of her organization was being scrubbed away, one efficient adjustment at a time. He stared at the empty space for several seconds longer than he should have, his chest tightening with a sudden, inexplicable pressure. Searching for a distraction, he pulled open the bottom drawer of his desk, the graveyard for forgotten memos and miscellaneous clutter. His hand brushed against something small and cool. It was her pen. A slim, matte black rollerball, the one she always kept clipped to her leather portfolio during high-stakes negotiations. She must have missed it in the quiet rush of her departure. He felt the slight wiggle of the loose cap, a byproduct of her habit of clicking it incessantly whenever a contract clause got too dense. He rolled it between his thumb and forefinger, the plastic still holding a phantom warmth that made his throat go dry. Dominic Hayes was a man built on the architecture of logic. He could forecast a market collapse before the first ticker tape fell. He could sense a bluff in a negotiation by the mere dilation of an opponent's pupil. But logic was a useless tool against this quiet, invasive ache that had taken up residence in his ribs. It wasn't a strategic failure. It was a haunting. The memory of the night it happened hit him with the force of a physical blow. It had been raining, a steady, rhythmic drumming against the floor-to-ceiling glass. They were deep into the Meridian acquisition, drowning in 3 unresolved clauses that threatened to tank the deal by daybreak. Savannah had stayed, of course. She had always been the last light burning in the building, a silent partner in his obsession. By 10:15, they were the only 2 souls left on the floor. The city glittered through the rain-streaked windows, a fractured mosaic of neon and shadow. Savannah was reading the dry legal jargon aloud, her voice a steady anchor in the gloom. Then she simply stopped. He looked up. She was staring out at the storm, her bottom lip caught between her teeth, a tiny human fracture in her professional mask. He should have looked back at the papers. He should have asked about Clause 4. Instead, the air in the room seemed to thicken, vibrating with the weight of 2 years of unsaid things. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. The words didn't sound like his. They were lower, rougher, stripped of their executive edge. She turned to him. The distance between them, which had always felt like miles of mahogany and protocol, suddenly felt like nothing at all. "Nothing I should be thinking about," she whispered. He didn't decide to stand up. His body simply moved, driven by a sudden tectonic shift in his own gravity. He crossed the room, the sound of his shoes on the carpet muffled by the roar of the rain. When he reached her, his hand hit the wall beside her head, trapping her in his space. His other hand found her jaw, tilting her face up to meet his. The kiss wasn't a question. It was a chaotic, long-overdue collision. It was the heat of every late-night coffee, every shared glance over a conference table, and every suppressed urge finally screaming to the surface. He felt her fingers tangle in his lapels, pulling him closer as if she were trying to climb inside his skin. When they finally broke apart, he had kept his eyes closed for a single, terrifying second. In that darkness, for the first time in his life, he hadn't known exactly what he was doing, and he hadn't cared. End of flashback. Dominic set the pen down on the desk. It looked small and insignificant against the vastness of his workspace. He picked up his phone and dialed Vanessa. She answered almost instantly. her voice warm, expectant, and perfectly appropriate. He made dinner reservations for Thursday, listening to her talk about a new gallery opening, but the words felt like static. "Wonderful," she said. "I've been waiting for you to call." Something in his chest went cold, a deep, sub-zero chill that no climate control could touch. He hung up and looked at the pen again. Then he looked at the glass partition, at the desk where a stranger now sat. He opened his laptop. The cursor blinked at him, a tiny rhythmic heartbeat of data. But for 40 minutes, the smartest man in the city did absolutely nothing but watch the light die on the screen. The apartment was small, but it possessed the one thing Savannah lacked: clarity. The light was the first thing she noticed, long, syrupy ribbons of gold that stretched across the hardwood floors in the late afternoon, illuminating dust motes that danced in the quiet. The kitchen was a narrow galley. The bedroom was barely large enough to house her bed, and the closet was a fraction of the size of her old life. She took it on the spot. "You sure?" the landlord had asked, his brow furrowed as he waited for the inevitable pivot to negotiation. "Very." The word felt like a physical weight leaving her chest. Moving day arrived with a frantic, messy energy. Her best friend, Maya, showed up with a bottle of cheap wine, 3 overflowing containers of takeout, and a fierce, unwavering conviction that Savannah had finally chosen herself. "I've been waiting for this for a year," Maya declared, sinking onto the bare floor since the sofa was still somewhere in transit. She shoved a container of pad thai toward Savannah. The steam smelled of peanut and liberation. "You never said anything." "Because you weren't ready to hear it." Maya pointed a chopstick at her, her expression sharpening with the honesty only a decade of friendship allows. "You would have defended him. You would have listed all the reasons it was complicated. You would have made excuses for a man who treats intimacy like a hostile takeover." Savannah uncorked the wine, the pop of the cork echoing in the empty room. "It was complicated. He kissed you like the world was ending and walked in the next morning with a trophy on his arm, Savannah. That's not a complication. That's a strategy." A heavy silence settled over them, the kind of quiet that only exists in a new home before the memories start to fill the corners. Outside, Chicago sang its own song, the rhythmic hum of distant traffic, the jagged wail of a siren, and the muffled pulse of someone's music drifting through an open window. "I know," Savannah said finally. The admission didn't come out as a sob. It was a slow exhale, like she was finally letting a poison leave her system after 3 weeks of holding her breath. Maya didn't say "I told you so." She simply leaned over and topped off Savannah's glass, the wine catching the last of the amber sun. Her new role at a mid-sized firm started that Monday. The office didn't smell like polished marble and expensive cologne. It smelled like paper, burnt coffee, and genuine effort. Her new manager, Brenda, a woman who favored sensible flats and called everyone Han, had a filing system that was approximately 40% as organized as Savannah's. Naturally, Savannah began fixing it by lunchtime. "You're going to be excellent here," Brenda told her on the 3rd day, her eyes crinkling with the kind of motherly warmth that felt like a localized sun. Savannah said thank you, and for the first time in a long time she wasn't performing. By the end of the 2nd week, something inside her was beginning, slowly, tentatively, to loosen. It wasn't healing. Healing was a jagged, ugly process that hadn't even started yet. But the tension was fading. She spent her evenings at the window, watching the city lights flicker to life. She made lists. She called her mother. She allowed herself to believe that the ghost of Hayes & Cohen was finally fading into the rearview mirror. Then, on a Tuesday evening, while the sink was full of soapy water and a podcast droned on about things that had absolutely nothing to do with her heart, a sharp, heavy knock sounded at her door. She wasn't expecting anyone. The sound sent a sudden, cold jolt of adrenaline through her veins. She twisted the faucet shut. The silence that followed was absolute. She dried her hands on a dish towel, her movements mechanical and slow. She walked to the door, her skin prickling with a sudden, irrational certainty of who was on the other side before she even reached for the handle. She peered through the peephole first, a reflexive, defensive habit. For a long, agonizing moment, the world simply stopped. He was standing in the dim hallway of her Chicago apartment building, draped in a dark overcoat with his tie conspicuously missing. His hair was slightly unsettled, the strands messy as if he'd spent the last 3 hours running his hands through them in a frantic loop. He looked like the Dominic Hayes she knew, the same imposing height, the same razor-edge jawline, but the finish had worn off. The polished, impenetrable lacquer that protected him from the world had grown dangerously thin, revealing a man who looked unexpectedly, jarringly human. She stood perfectly still, her palm pressed against the cool wood of the door. He knocked again, a single heavy strike. "Savannah." His voice through the door was quiet, devoid of its usual boardroom command. It didn't demand, it bled. "I know you're there. I saw the light under the door shift." She pressed her lips together, the taste of her own heartbeat rising in her throat. Then, she opened it, just a sliver. The heavy security chain remained engaged, a steel reminder of the boundaries she had fought so hard to build. The look on his face when he finally saw her was a blow she wasn't prepared to take. He didn't mask it fast enough. A raw, jagged mixture of relief and profound regret flickered across his features before he could pull the shutters back down. "How did you get this address?" Her voice was a marvel of engineering, steady, calm, and as cold as a Chicago winter. "Your emergency contact file, from HR." A pause, his eyes searching hers. "I know how that sounds. It sounds like you accessed private employee records for personal gain." "You're right." He didn't flinch. He didn't offer a corporate apology. He stood there and let the accusation land, his gaze never wavering. "I did." She studied him through the gap. The expensive suit, no briefcase, no Vanessa. He had traveled hundreds of miles on a Tuesday night to stand in a drafty hallway with the hollowed-out expression of a man who had rehearsed 1,000 words and forgotten every single one of them the moment the door cracked open. "Dominic." She used his name like a shield, not a greeting. "Whatever you've come to say." 3 minutes. His voice dropped, vibrating with a low-frequency desperation. "That's all I'm asking. After that, if you tell me to go, I'll walk away. You won't hear from me again. I'll vanish." 3 minutes. It's the length of a pop song, the time it takes for a kettle to whistle. And yet, Savannah stood at that door for a lifetime, weighing those 180 seconds against the systematic destruction of her heart. She had every reason to close it, reasons that were etched into her bones, fueled by the humiliation of that Friday morning. But she had spent the last 2 weeks lying to herself about being over it, and the way her pulse was currently hammering against her ribs suggested that her recovery was nothing more than a well-staged performance. She reached up and unlatched the chain. The metallic slide sounded like a gunshot in the small hallway. The door swung open. She stepped back, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as if to hold herself together. In the cramped confines of the apartment, his presence was overwhelming. He was significantly taller than her, a fact she had managed to ignore in the vast, high-ceilinged spaces of Hayes & Co. But here, in her sanctuary, he felt like a storm that had wandered indoors. He looked at her, then his gaze drifted past her shoulder, taking in the small space, the golden light, the narrow kitchen, and then his eyes landed on the kitchen windowsill. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek as he spotted the small, green succulent bathing in the Chicago sun. He looked back at her. "Savannah." He said her name with a weight she had never heard before, as if the syllables were made of lead and he was finally, painfully setting them down after carrying them for miles. He didn't lead with an apology. Savannah had been bracing for one, something practiced and executive, the kind of carefully curated statement that mirrors accountability without actually costing the speaker a cent. Instead, he looked at her with a raw, unsettling honesty and said, "I don't know how to do this." Savannah kept her arms locked across her chest, her posture a fortress of silence. "I spent 20 minutes standing in that hallway," he continued, his voice catching on the dry air of the apartment. "I wrote things down on the flight, arguments, explanations, a dozen versions of a script, and the moment you opened that door, They all turned to ash. "Why don't you try anyway?" she challenged. The words were sharp, intended to draw blood, but her voice wavered just enough to betray her. He exhaled, a long, jagged sound. He dropped his gaze to the floor for a heartbeat before pinning her with a look of startling intensity. The night in the conference room. "I kissed you because I wanted to. It wasn't the adrenaline of the deal or the fact that it was 3 in the morning or any other convenient excuse. I wanted you. I've wanted you for longer than I'm willing to admit because I think the truth of it would only make this more unbearable." Savannah felt her throat tighten, a hot, suffocating knot of emotion rising in her chest. She remained silent. And then, the next morning, he stopped, his jaw working as he searched for the words. "I panicked. That is the only honest word for it. I panicked, and I made a calculated choice to protect my own ego at your expense. I watched the light go out of your eyes while I was doing it, Savannah. I knew exactly what I was breaking, and I did it anyway. That is the part I can't justify." "Vanessa," she said, the name tasting like vinegar, "was never anything real." She knew the terms. I think she hoped for more, but... He shook his head, a gesture of profound dismissal. It was a performance, a distraction, and it wasn't fair to her either. It wasn't fair to me. The words were quiet, but they carried a lethal edge. They cut through the remaining space between them like a wire. "No," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "It wasn't." The apartment settled into a heavy, absolute stillness. Outside, a car hissed past on the damp pavement, and the low hum of the refrigerator seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since she'd unlatched the door. He stood with his hands loose at his sides, his fingers twitching slightly, as if they didn't know how to exist without a pen or a phone to grip. Dominic Hayes was a man of deliberate, curated motion, but here he looked discarded. He had run out of useful defenses and was simply standing in the wreckage of his own design. "I don't know what you want me to do with any of this," she whispered. "Nothing," he replied. "I'm not here to ask for a second chance or a signature. I just needed you to know that it was real, that I felt the same earthquake you did, even when I was pretending the ground was perfectly still." She searched his face for a long time, looking for the lie, but all she found was the devastating weight of his sincerity. "That doesn't fix anything, Dominic." "I know." It was simple, unhesitating. He wasn't negotiating. "You can't just materialize at my door, hand me an explanation, and expect it to be okay." "I know that too." She finally uncrossed her arms, the tension leaving her shoulders in a slow, painful drain. She shoved her hands into her pockets. The anger was still there, a bright, flickering coal in her gut. But beneath it, something else was shifting, something she lacked the strength to name tonight. "You should go," she said. He nodded, the movement stiff. He retrieved his jacket from the chair by the door, moving past her in the narrow hallway. He was close enough that she could feel the radiating heat of him, close enough to smell the faint, expensive scent of his cologne mixed with the cold Chicago air. She didn't reach out. The door clicked shut behind him, the sound of the latch seating itself feeling final and hollow. Savannah stood exactly where she was for 60 seconds, her breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. Then her legs simply gave way. She sat down on the floor, her back pressed against the cold plaster of the wall, because the couch felt 1,000 miles away. She pressed the heels of her hands into her eyes until she saw stars, trying to push the image of his broken face out of her mind. The truth doesn't ask for permission before it rearranges your world. It just arrives uninvited and leaves you to deal with the ruins. The notification light flickered at 11:47 p.m., a silent pulse in the dark. It was an unknown number, but Savannah didn't need a contact name to recognize the cadence of the sender. "I'm at the Langham on Michigan Avenue. I'm not ready to give up." That was it. No desperate plea, no follow-up, and no punctuation beyond that final, definitive period. It was peak Dominic Hayes, precise, deliberate, and devastatingly efficient even when his world was fraying at the edges. Savannah read the words 4 times, the blue light of the screen searing the sentence into her retinas. She didn't respond. She set the phone face down on the nightstand with a hollow thud and spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, watching the shadows of passing cars stretch and distort across the plaster like ghosts of the life she'd left behind. What do you do with a confession like that? What do you do when the man who dismantled your pride finally offers the truth, and the truth is exactly what you feared it would be? It's the one thing you wanted, the one thing you told yourself to stop dreaming about, now sitting in your inbox like a live wire. You don't sleep. You lie in the darkness with a single sentence looping through your brain, feeling the steady, rhythmic ache of a wound being reopened. She went to work the next morning. She performed her duties with a surgical, mechanical focus because excellence was a reflex she couldn't suppress. She cleared 17 emails, decimated a filing system that had been a disaster for a decade, and sat through a 3-hour meeting as the most prepared person in the room. But her mind was a split screen. On one side was the budget report, and on the other was a hotel room on Michigan Avenue. Maya called during the lunch hour. "How are you?" "Fine." "Savannah, try again." "He's still in Chicago." The line went quiet for a beat. Oh. He texted last night." She repeated the message from memory. Maya didn't jump in with a joke this time. "Okay," Maya said, her voice dropping into a rare, serious register. "I need you to hear me. That is either the most romantic thing a man has ever done or a massive red flag. And I genuinely don't know which. What are you feeling?" "I don't know." "Yes, you do. You always know. You just don't always want to admit it." Savannah stayed silent, the sound of her own shallow breathing loud in her ear. "You still love him," Maya said, not as a question but as a gentle, heavy fact. That was never the problem. "Then what is? Whether he's capable of being worth it." That evening, Savannah took the long way home. She walked past the river, watching the water churn under the bridges, and through the park where the October light was doing something spectacular with the dying leaves, turning the trees into a riot of bruised purples and burning oranges. She was just starting to feel the city's rhythm settle her nerves when she turned the corner of her block and froze. Dominic was standing outside her building. He wasn't at her door this time. He was on the sidewalk, 20 feet away, hands buried deep in his coat pockets. He was looking at his phone, his shoulders hunched against the biting Chicago wind. And beside him, close enough to suggest an intimacy that made Savannah's blood run cold, was Vanessa. Savannah couldn't hear the words. She could only see the tableau, Vanessa's manicured hand resting on his arm, her head tilted toward his in a gesture of practiced, soft concern. Dominic's posture was a stiff line of resistance, his face turned slightly away, but from a distance, the optics were damning. It looked like two people who belonged together, standing in the cold. Savannah didn't wait to see more. She turned on her heel and walked the other way, her footsteps quick and frantic against the concrete. She didn't look back. She didn't know that Vanessa had appeared at the Langham an hour earlier, unannounced. She had charmed the concierge with a tragic story about being a worried fiancé, a lie delivered with the smooth, frictionless ease of a professional. She had cornered Dominic in the lobby, pleading with him. "I know you're making a mistake. I know this city isn't where you belong. That girl doesn't know you." He had listened with the cold, glacial precision he reserved for a deal that had already gone south. Then, he had looked her in the eye and said, "Go home, Vanessa. We're done." She had eventually listened, but not before ensuring she was seen. Vanessa had always known exactly how to weaponize visibility, and as she walked away, she knew the damage was already done. She didn't text him back. The next morning, his message was still there, sitting in her inbox like a live round of ammunition. Even though she had memorized every syllable, every pixel, she refused to acknowledge it. She went to work, moved through the motions of her day, and anchored herself to the decision she had made in the cold of the previous evening. She had seen what she had seen. The optics weren't just a suggestion, they were a confirmation. Maybe Vanessa had followed him to Chicago, Maybe it wasn't his doing. But it didn't change the fundamental truth: he was Dominic Hayes, and wherever he stood, a localized storm of chaos and high-stakes manipulation followed. She had already been the collateral damage once. She didn't need to be the wreckage again. This is the moment where you want to reach into the scene and grab her by the shoulders. You want to scream, ask him. Just once strip away the pride and ask him what that was. Because you can see the tragedy she can't. That she is arming herself with half-truths, and that fear, when it's dressed up as clarity, is still just fear. But you also know the weight of the scar tissue. When you've been wounded in the same spot enough times, your nervous system stops looking for the truth and starts looking for the exit. It doesn't wait for the fire. It runs at the first scent of smoke. Dominic felt the shift the second her silence stretched past the 24-hour mark. He had been monitoring his phone with the singular obsessive focus he usually reserved for a multi-billion-dollar merger. A realization that sat in his gut with a heavy, uncharacteristic sense of irony. He was the smartest man in most rooms, yet he was currently a captive to a digital void. By Thursday, the silence felt like a sentencing. He ordered room service he didn't touch, the silver cloches growing cold on the table like monuments to his failure. He worked through the night on tasks that were meaningless in the grand scheme, fueling himself on black coffee and a growing sense of displacement. He had handled the COO's calls regarding the Meridian deal with his usual chilling competence, all while sitting in a hotel room feeling a raw, unproductive ache that had no place in his spreadsheet-driven life. He had called Vanessa the morning after her ambush. He had been brief, his voice like a sheet of ice. "Don't do that again. We're done." She had hung up without a word, a reaction he deemed efficient and fair. But Savannah didn't know about that call, and he didn't know that she was operating on a different set of facts. They were two people speaking two different languages in the same quiet city. On Friday morning, he pulled up a travel site. He stared at the 7 p.m. flight back to New York, the cursor hovering over the confirm button. It felt like signing a surrender. He didn't click it. That afternoon, Maya appeared at Savannah's office like a sudden change in the weather. She dropped into the chair across from Savannah's desk, her presence vibrating with the authority of an 11-year friendship. "I need to say one thing," Maya began, her eyes locked on Savannah's. "Just one, and then I'll leave you alone. That has never once been true in the history of our friendship." "One thing." Maya leaned forward, her voice dropping into a register of pure, unadulterated honesty. "You saw them together outside your building. You drew a conclusion. You let the old ghost of Vanessa haunt a new city. Did you actually ask him about it?" Savannah looked at her, her mouth suddenly dry. "Did you ask him what they were doing there? What she said? What he said? Did you give him the chance to be anything other than the villain you've already cast him as?" "I don't—" "Because if you didn't," Maya interrupted, her words landing like a precise surgical strike, "then you're doing exactly what you've been punishing him for. You assumed. You took a fragmented image and used it to shatter the whole picture." The air in the office felt thin. Maya stood up, her point made. Okay, that was it. One thing. She slung her bag over her shoulder. "Call me when you're ready to talk." She paused at the glass door, her expression softening. "Or call him. One of you deserves the truth more than the other, Savannah. Figure out which one it is." Savannah sat in the ensuing silence for a long time, the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock sounding like a countdown she wasn't ready to finish. She cleaned her apartment on Saturday, the deep, obsessive kind of cleaning that has nothing to do with dust and everything to do with a cluttered mind. She dragged the furniture across the floor, the harsh scrape of wood against wood echoing in the quiet, and swept away the debris of her first 2 weeks. She reorganized the kitchen, rearranged the books on the small shelf by the window, and at the end of 3 hours, she stood in the center of the room with raw palms and a racing heart, feeling exactly as unsettled as when she'd first picked up the broom. She sank onto the couch, the late afternoon light filtered through the good windows, tracing long, melancholic shadows across the floorboards. She found herself thinking about the pen. Not just any pen, her pen. The one she'd left in his desk. It hadn't been a calculated move. It was a ghost she'd accidentally left behind. She'd noticed its absence the moment she finished packing, yet she hadn't gone back for it. Now, she sat there wondering if he'd found it, or if he'd simply swept it into the trash along with the rest of her existence. The fact that her heart was snagged on a $4 piece of plastic told her everything she needed to know about the state of her own wreckage. She let herself think about the kiss, not with the jagged grief of the morning after, but the memory of the heat itself, the way he had crossed that conference room, not as a boss but as a man who had finally reached his breaking point. The way his voice had dropped, losing its executive edge when he asked what she was thinking. The way his hand had cradled her jaw, as if he were trying to memorize the architecture of her face before the world started turning again. She thought about him standing at her door with no armor, admitting he was lost. Dominic Hayes, a man who moved through the world with the terrifying certainty of a god, had boarded a plane, hunted down an address, and paced her hallway for 20 minutes before finding the courage to knock. She thought about Maya's voice, sharp and true. "You assumed." She pulled her knees to her chest, tucked her chin, and finally allowed herself the luxury of the truth. "I know what it's like to be paralyzed by the very thing you crave. We all do. Because wanting something real, something with teeth, means you have everything to lose. And once you've already tasted that loss, even if you were the one who walked away to save yourself, risking it again feels like madness. It requires the terrifying decision to say, I would rather know the worst than wonder for the rest of my life." She reached for her phone. His number was already there, burned into the recents list. She hadn't deleted it. She hadn't been able to. She typed, "Are you still in Chicago?" She set the phone down on the cushion as if it were a live explosive. Then she picked it up, set it down again. Her pulse was a frantic, erratic beat against the silence of the room. The phone buzzed. Yes. She stared at the word. A single syllable. No punctuation. But it was immediate. A reflex, as if he'd been sitting there with the phone in his hand, waiting for a ghost to speak. He had answered before she could even begin to build a case for why she shouldn't have sent it. She typed, "Can we talk?" Not on the phone. 30 seconds of the ellipsis dancing on the screen, the most agonizing half-minute of her life. Tell me where and when. She chose the park by the river. Neutral ground, open air, no walls to be pressed against, no mahogany conference tables to serve as a barrier between their lives. Here, under the vast, indifferent sky, there was nowhere left for either of them to hide. He was already there when she arrived, a dark silhouette against the shimmering gray of the water. He was standing with his hands buried deep in his coat pockets, his shoulders tight, as if he were bracing for a physical impact. He turned the second her footsteps crunched on the gravel path, and something happened to his face. A sudden, violent flicker of vulnerability that he didn't even attempt to manage. She came to a halt a few feet away, the distance between them vibrating like a live wire. "You're still here," she said, her voice barely carrying over the rush of the water. "It's been almost 2 weeks. I couldn't make myself leave." He said it with a quiet, exhausted honesty, as if the gravity of the city itself had pinned him to the sidewalk. The river churned past them, a steady, rhythmic pulse. A cyclist whirred by on the path behind her, a brief flash of neon in the periphery of a world that had narrowed down to just the two of them. "I saw you outside my building," she said, her gaze steady. "With Vanessa." His expression shifted, a flash of realization, followed quickly by a look of profound frustration with himself. "She came to the hotel. I told her to leave. I didn't realize she'd followed me to your street." He paused, the wind catching his hair and messily undoing the last of his composure. "I should have texted you. You didn't think I'd see?" "I didn't think, period. That has been a recurring problem lately." He said it without a trace of irony. It was a clinical, precise autopsy of his own failure. She looked out at the water. He kept his eyes on her, his gaze heavy and expectant, like a man waiting for a verdict. "I need to ask you something," she said, finally turning back to him, "and I need you to answer it honestly. Not strategically, Not carefully, no corporate spin. Okay. How long? He didn't ask for clarification. He didn't pretend not to understand. Since the Baron's pitch, he said. 14 months ago. You stayed until midnight to restructure the entire presentation because I'd snapped that the numbers weren't landing. At some point you looked up and said almost to yourself, there, that's the argument. That's the one that will win. And you were right. You were always right. He stopped, glancing away for a heartbeat before his eyes locked back onto hers. I sat across from you in that fluorescent light and I thought, this is a problem. 14 months. She exhaled slowly, the breath puffing out into the cold air like a white flag. And you never said anything. You were my assistant. He said it as if it explained the universe. And in his world, perhaps it did. I told myself it was inappropriate. I told myself it was a temporary glitch in my judgment that would eventually pass. He let out a short, dry sound that wasn't quite a laugh. It didn't. And the night in the conference room was me finally losing a war I'd been fighting against myself for over a year. The silence that followed was absolute. Somewhere behind them, a child's laughter rang out, followed by the frantic yapping of a dog. The ordinary world was continuing its mundane rotation, entirely unaware of the tectonic plates shifting between them. I was in love with you, she said. The words were simple, delivered in the past tense by grammatical instinct, even if her heart was currently screaming otherwise. For a long time, I never said anything either. I thought. She shook her head, the memory of 2 years of silent longing stinging her eyes. I thought I was the only one standing in that fire. You weren't. I know that now. He took a single step toward her, just one, and then stopped, waiting. He was no longer the man who took what he wanted. He was a man asking for permission to exist in her space. She looked up at him, at the green eyes that had dominated her life for 2 years, 3 months, and a handful of days she'd finally stopped counting. The ice was gone, replaced by a deep, aching hope that was almost too much to look at. He extended his hand, palm up, open. It wasn't a grab. It wasn't a command. It was an offering, a silent request to bridge the miles they had put between each other. She looked at his hand for a long, quiet time. The river moved past. The wind sighed through the trees. And in the center of the storm, Savannah Reed finally reached back. She called on Sunday morning, the vibration of the phone against the wooden nightstand sounding like an intrusion. Savannah didn't recognize the number, but the voice that filtered through the speaker was immediately, unmistakably familiar. It carried a curated warmth that didn't quite reach the eyes, even through a digital signal. I thought we should talk, Vanessa said, her tone smooth and measured. It was the voice of a woman who had rehearsed every syllable in a mirror before dialing. Woman to woman, without Dominic in the middle. Savannah's first instinct was to hang up, to sever the connection and the drama along with it. Her second instinct was the same. But she listened to the third, the one that whispered, "Hear her out. Know exactly what you're up against." "I'm listening," Savannah replied, her voice as level as a horizon. "He does this," Vanessa began, her words falling like slow, rhythmic drops of poison. "He finds a focus, a project, or a person, and he directs the full, terrifying force of his attention toward them. And for a while, it feels like the sun. But Dominic Hayes doesn't fundamentally change. He's a man who carved out a life for himself at 22 and hasn't left room for a soul since. This intimacy you think you've found, he'll maintain it until it becomes a liability. Then, he'll find a graceful exit." A pause followed, heavy and deliberate. "I've been with him on and off for 3 years. I know the script. I know how the final act ends. And I'm telling you this because no one was kind enough to tell me. Do you know what the most dangerous kind of lie is? It's the one built around a skeleton of the truth." Savannah knew, she felt it in her marrow, that Vanessa's portrait of Dominic wasn't a total work of fiction. He had been cold. He had taken the exit. He had chosen the safety of his own shadow over the light of honesty. Vanessa wasn't just guessing. She was weaponizing his history, counting on the fact that his past was loud enough to drown out his present. Savannah was still sitting with the phone gripped in her hand when the knock sounded at her door. She opened it. Dominic stood there, but the second his eyes met hers, his brow furrowed. He read the shift in the air before she even spoke. What happened? She held up the phone, the screen still glowing. Vanessa called me. A profound stillness settled over him. The heavy, pressurized quiet that precedes a storm. What did she say? Savannah repeated the conversation. She gave it to him straight, without editorializing or softening the blow, watching his face for the slightest crack. When she finished, he didn't offer a frantic denial. He didn't get angry. He simply exhaled. Everything she said about who I've been, he said, his voice resonant and steady, is accurate. Savannah blinked, the honesty of the admission catching her off guard. I won't stand here and tell you she's lying about my history. I have put work above every living thing for my entire adult life. I have used emotional distance as a tactical advantage. I have made choices, selfish, cowardly choices, to protect my own comfort at your expense. He held her gaze, his green eyes fixed on hers with a raw, unblinking intensity. All of that is true. Then, what she's wrong about, he interrupted, his voice gaining a hard, absolute edge, is that I am incapable of changing. And she's wrong about why she called you. This isn't sisterly concern. This is a woman who spent 3 years as a placeholder for a life I was too afraid to pursue. She knows what I feel for you is different, and she's trying to burn the bridge because she can't stand that I'm finally capable of something real, just not with her. He took a half step forward, closing the gap until she could feel the heat of his presence. Savannah, I'm not asking you to forget the man I was. I'm asking you to let me show you the man I am choosing to become. Those are two very different things. The air in the small apartment was perfectly still, suspended in the weight of his words. I know, she said quietly. She pulled out her phone, her fingers moving with a swift, final grace. She found Vanessa's number and blocked it. She set the device on the counter with a definitive clack. Later that afternoon, Dominic stepped into the hallway to make a call of his own. Savannah didn't hear the exchange. She stayed in the kitchen, focusing on the simple, grounding rhythm of steam rising from a teacup. He was gone only a minute. When he returned, he said only, "That's done." And she believed him. She believed him the way you believe the sound of a heavy door finally clicking shut in its frame. That evening, they sat side by side on her small couch. Outside the good windows, the Chicago skyline was beginning to twinkle into life, a vast carpet of amber and violet. You know this is going to be complicated, Savannah murmured, leaning her head back. Yes. You live in New York, I live here, and I actually like this job, Dominic. I know. I am not moving back to be your assistant. I am not going back to that desk. I wouldn't let you if you tried. He said it with a fierce, unwavering certainty. I'm not interested in the past. I'm interested in wherever we go from here. Savannah considered the weight of that, the distance, the history, the work ahead. Okay, she said. Just that. Okay. But the way she said it, decisive, quiet, and stripped of all conditions, meant everything. It was the sound of a beginning. He flew back to New York the following Tuesday. There were weights that required his specific strength. The Meridian acquisition was entering its final, surgical stages, board meetings loomed like storms on the horizon, and the mechanical reality of commanding 3,000 souls didn't pause for a personal awakening, no matter how profound. He went. He worked. By every professional metric, he was the same Dominic Hayes, a man of ironclad focus and chilling efficiency. But the evenings belonged to a different man. He called her every night. Sometimes the calls were brief. 20 minutes of Savannah recounting Brenda's latest workplace quirk, or Dominic relaying a minute negotiation detail that would have bored anyone else to tears. They were learning the texture of each other's voices at the end of a long day, finding the hidden harmonies in the mundane. Sometimes they didn't even speak. They simply stayed on the line, the quiet crackle of the connection serving as a bridge across the miles, a shared silence that said more than 1,000 words. 3 weeks later, on a Friday that felt like a long-awaited exhale, he flew back to Chicago. He'd told her he was coming. He'd promised 7 o'clock. At 7:02 p.m., the familiar heavy knock echoed through her apartment. This time she didn't hesitate. She didn't check the peephole to verify the threat or the promise. She simply opened the door, her heart already knowing who was standing in the hall. Dominic was there, draped in the same dark coat, tieless, his hair slightly wild from the biting Chicago wind. He was holding something out with an expression that was almost shy, a look of profound, vulnerable absurdity. It was her pen. The black one, slim and matte, with the cap that never quite clicked into place. "You left this," he said, his voice low. She looked at the small object, then up at him, the ridiculousness and the gravity of it hitting her all at once. "I looked for that for a week," she whispered. "I've had it for 2 months." He paused, his gaze searching hers. "I should have told you sooner. I'm telling you now." She reached out and took the pen. Their fingers brushed, a brief electric contact that sent a jolt through her system. Neither of them moved to break the touch. They stood there in the threshold, the hallway light casting long shadows behind him. "You came back," she said, her voice barely a breath. "I'll keep coming back." He said it with the absolute, terrifying certainty he reserved for things he believed in with his whole soul. "For as long as you want me to, Savannah. For as long as you'll have me." That is the quiet secret of a love that takes the long way home. When it finally arrives, after the tests, the questions, and the jagged lessons learned in the dark, it doesn't feel like a firework. It feels like an arrival. It's less of a sudden explosion and more of a deep, resonant, of course. It's the feeling of a puzzle piece finally clicking into place after you've spent years convinced the set was incomplete. And of course doesn't mean it will be easy. It just means it's finally real. Savannah stepped back from the doorway, opening her life as much as her home. She let him in. Chicago on a Sunday morning possesses a particular rhythmic grace, a quiet, unhurried self-possession, like a city that has finally stopped seeking anyone else's approval. Savannah stood at the kitchen counter, the floorboards cool against her bare feet. She was draped in an oversized cardigan that belonged to him, moving with the fluid, effortless comfort of a woman who had fully reclaimed her own space. She was brewing coffee and scanning her phone simultaneously, her movements a synchronized dance of domestic peace. Dominic emerged from the bedroom, moving with a relaxed stride that would have been unrecognizable to the board members at Hayes & Co. He sat at the small table by the window, right next to the succulent. The plant had flourished, its green leaves reaching greedily for the morning light in the spot Savannah had cleared for it. She didn't need to be asked. She brought 2 mugs over, the steam curling into the morning air, and set his down before sinking into the chair across from him. Outside, the city was transitioning. October was bleeding into November, the air turning crisp and sharp in that particular way that happens at this latitude. They sat together in the quiet. He scrolled through a briefing. She scanned an article. Occasionally, a headline or a stray thought would pass between them, small, intimate fragments of a life that didn't require a constant, frantic defense. It was a comfortable silence, the kind that only exists between 2 people who no longer feel the need to perform. She hadn't returned to New York. She hadn't traded her autonomy for the comfort of a familiar office. Instead, Dominic had restructured his world. He'd joined 3 Chicago-based boards he used to handle via video, deciding that some things were worth the flight every single time. It wasn't a simple arrangement. It was a logistical puzzle of red-eye flights and shared calendars, but they had learned that simple was often just a synonym for easy, and they were done with easy. At some point, Savannah looked up and caught him watching her. It wasn't the guarded, sideways glance of the man who spent 2 years afraid of his own shadow. It was an open, steady gaze, the way a man looks at the only thing in the room that actually matters. She raised an eyebrow, a small, knowing spark in her eyes. "What?" "Nothing," he replied. He said it with a faint ghost of a smile, the exact way she had said it 14 months ago in the dim light of Conference Room B. Nothing I should be thinking about. The recognition hit her instantly, a warm, golden hum of memory that settled in her chest. She didn't say a word. She just reached across the table, her palm open. He took her hand, his grip firm and sure, anchoring them both to the here and now.